From enormous nuclear reactors to international pipelines and megadams, nothing shows the power of construction quite like an energy megaproject. With massive scale and even bigger impact, these schemes quite literally power our world. Sit back, relax, and get ready to take in some of the biggest energy megaprojects from around this planet. It's an immense project. Since 2005, Finland's been constructing the largest nuclear reactor in Europe, alongside a facility that could solve the problem of what to do with spent nuclear fuel. When you think nuclear, the Nordic nation doesn't immediately jump to mind, but if all of its planned projects come to fruition, then by the end of the decade, the country will be second only to France in terms of the percentage of energy drawn from nuclear systems. After more than a decade of delays and cost overruns, 2022 will see the world's happiest country switch on one of the planet's most advanced reactors, potentially kickstarting a new age of nuclear power. Finland actually has a long history with nuclear power. Its first reactor came online in 1977, and by 1980 3 more were operational, providing a third of Finland's total energy needs. While these reactors are among the most efficient in the world, running at a 95% capacity factor for the past decade and continually being uprated over their life cycle, growing demand and the seasonal fluctuations of other renewable sources like hydro and solar has left the country relying on imports from Russia and Sweden to make up the balance of its energy needs. To lessen its reliance on foreign energy and help meet its goal of carbon neutrality by 2035, the Finnish government approved the construction of what was meant to be the world's first third-generation pressurised water reactor, or ERP, at its Olkiluoto nuclear plant known as OL3 in 2005. With an initial cost of $3.9 billion, OL3 was to nearly double the plant's existing output and provide 14% of Finland's energy needs when it became operational by 2010. But while OL3 was the first EPR to begin construction ahead of other next-generation reactors in France, China and the UK, complexities surrounding the design, defects in safety systems and contractual disputes led to over a decade of delays, and in 2018 China's Taishan 1 became the first EPR reactor in the world to start operating. Despite these delays and the cost swelling to over $10.2 billion, OL3 was granted an operation licence by Finland's Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority in 2019, and in March 2021 116 tonnes of uranium began to be loaded into the reactor ahead of its final testing phase. Once it's connected to the grid and the reactor begins commercial production in early 2022, the countdown will be on until OL3 begins adding to Finland's spent fuel stockpile. Nuclear power is an incredibly clean way to produce energy, but it does create a byproduct, and it's the one problem we've yet to truly solve. After 3 to 6 years, irradiated material is no longer able to sustain a reaction as a viable fuel source, and new material must be brought in to maintain the reactor's efficiency. But while it's unable to generate electricity, spent fuel remains highly radioactive and needs to be isolated for hundreds of thousands of years to prevent it causing harm to people or the surrounding environment. Although spent fuel can be re-enriched and re-enter the fuel cycle, the main way we currently deal with radioactive waste is to simply store it in pools or sealed dry storage facilities while it slowly decays. While these methods keep spent fuel contained, it's not a viable long-term solution, as the system is heavily reliant on mechanical and human intervention, and even under the strictest conditions it can be vulnerable to attacks of terrorism or natural disasters, the kind that led to the events at Fukushima in 2011. With an estimated 250,000 tonnes of high-level waste already in storage around the world, and with no long-term strategy of dealing with it, many countries have chosen to completely rule out nuclear power when it comes to meeting their growing energy needs. In an attempt to solve this, since 2005, Posiva, a joint venture between Finland's two nuclear power providers, has been constructing the world's first deep geological repository for spent fuel in the billion-year-old bedrock not far from OL3. Funded by charges collected from consumers through electricity sales, the $1 billion project that's due to complete in 2023 will see a series of tunnels extend half a kilometre below ground, creating a permanent disposal facility for spent fuel. Now, while burying nuclear waste might sound alarming and may cause concern to environmental groups, the process at Olkiluoto is so much more than simply burying the problem. Based on a Swedish disposal method known as KBS3, irradiated material is placed into boron steel canisters and enclosed within corrosion-resistant copper capsules before being buried in individual holes and backfilled with bentonite clay, entombing it forever. Once buried, no further mechanical or human intervention is required to contain the radioactive payload, essentially eliminating one of the biggest barriers many countries have when it comes to adopting nuclear power. With the capacity to accommodate the last 50 years' worth of Finland's accumulated spent fuel, and the needs of its existing reactors until at least 2120, at which time the facility will be permanently sealed, Olkiluoto appears to provide a viable long-term solution to dealing with nuclear waste. Described as a game-changer for the industry by the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the lessons learned at Olkiluoto are being shared with other countries, and regions with suitable geological characteristics are being considered for similar disposal sites. Having seemingly solved the biggest drawback of nuclear power, and with a sixth reactor already planned to begin construction next year, Finland looks set to play a leading role in the widespread adoption of nuclear technology as the world continues to transition away from fossil fuels. If you're based in Europe like me, and you like the warm like me, then you might have noticed your heating bills going up by quite a bit lately. The continent's in the grip of an energy crisis caused by rising demand, gas supplies that are lower than normal, and a shortage of renewable power. But there's hope. The completion of this massive construction project could, in theory, help solve the issue straight away. But this is no ordinary energy scheme. It's not a power plant or a hydroelectric dam. Instead, it's something that at first glance seems a little more, well, basic.
It's, a pipe.
And yet it's impacting millions of people, creating tensions between some of the world's most powerful countries.
One of those areas of disagreement, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we continue to believe is a threat to Europe's energy security.
And continuing to make global headlines.
Fears are growing in Europe that it could be a cold winter.
This is how a simple pipeline became one of Europe's most controversial construction projects. Now, we know what you're thinking. Why on earth is the B1M doing a video on a pipe? Well, there's actually quite a bit more to it than that. Nord Stream 2 is a brand new pipeline that's going to bring an additional source of natural gas from Russia to mainland Europe via Germany. Having another supply of this fuel at a time when it's becoming ever more scarce sounds ideal, but there's a problem. It's all built and fully plumbed in, but they've had a bit of trouble turning on the tap, so to speak. Before we get into those details, let's rewind a bit. Running parallel to the original Nord Stream line built almost a decade ago, the $11 billion Nord Stream 2 stretches over 1,200 kilometres and crosses the economic zones of 5 countries, making it one of the longest offshore pipelines in the world. It's formed from around 100,000 pieces in total, each weighing 24 tonnes. Oh, and there are 2 of them. It's a twin line. Once operational, it'll provide 55 billion cubic metres of gas per year, enough for 26 million homes, with the capacity to handle around a third of the EU's future import needs. Construction started in 2018, and by late 2019 it was almost done. Using the world's largest construction ship, called Pioneering Spirit, the crew was laying up to 3 kilometres of piping every day. Sections were welded and tested on board before being added to the main pipe and then lowered down to the seabed. It was also built in stages, which meant several connections had to be made at sea. Now, to avoid water flooding into the pipe, some sections had to be lifted back out and connected on the surface, in a process that's imaginatively called an above-water tie-in. But some of the most impressive work was done back on land, particularly at the German end. Here, two 700-metre micro-tunnels were constructed, connecting the receiving station to the pipeline as it nears the shore. This involved digging an entry shaft at the station and dropping a tunnel boring machine inside. That then burrowed towards the water, laying pieces of pipe as it went. Once under the seabed, the machine was dug out and removed before the land and sea pipe sections were connected. Over on the Russian side, Nord Stream 2 only had to go a few kilometres inland to connect to an existing pipeline that brings in gas from the Arctic YAML fields. This all means that Nord Stream 2 is considerably shorter overall than the current pipeline that goes from Russia to Germany through Ukraine and the so-called Central Corridor. It's the new route though where all the controversy is. It might be a shortcut, but it also bypasses Ukraine. That's a country that's been in conflict with Russia since 2014.
Russian troops moving swiftly to take control of military bases in Crimea.
But the first shots in Moscow's occupation of Crimea have already been fired.
To what America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
It's a country that relies a lot on the current pipelines for income, and it's a country that's set to lose out under the new scheme if Nord Stream 2 becomes a priority line. Since 2016, deliveries via Ukraine have decreased substantially, while gas coming through Nord Stream 1 has increased. There's also fears that this could give Russia too much power and even control over the European energy system, as it would see its gas exports to Germany and the wider grid double. Some critics have warned that it could be used as a geopolitical weapon, a suggestion that Russia has denied.
I believe this is a weapon. I believe that it's wrong not to see that this is a dangerous weapon, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe.
Already over a third of the continent's gas comes from Russia, which is financing half the scheme through state-owned Gazprom, with 5 European energy firms covering the rest. Concerns about Europe becoming too dependent on Russian gas is what caused that 2-year delay between late 2019 and 2021, with the US threatening sanctions. Other opponents of Nord Stream 2 have included Poland and other Eastern EU countries. However, an agreement was made between the US and Germany in July 2021 that allowed construction to finish. But in November, the certification process required for the pipeline to open was halted by the German regulator. Due to this unexpected setback, gas prices went up even further. A new German arm of the operating company now has to be set up before final approvals are given. All the while, those worries about the scale of Russia's influence haven't gone away. For whatever might happen next, and despite the understandable opposition, Nord Stream 2 is still an impressive feat of engineering that really underlines the impact construction can have on so many people's lives. Of course, many countries are currently investing in renewable energy and making big commitments to go green over the coming decades, all of which will reduce the influence of Russian fossil fuels. But until we can switch off the gas for good, and with demand still increasing, we're kinda stuck with it for now. It might not be the answer everyone wants, but others say it's what Europe needs for the time being. That is, once its flame is actually lit.
This is where they are building the largest nuclear fusion reactor in the world. Right now, I am inside the assembly hall of the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor in the south of France. And just behind me back there is where scientists and engineers are working to replicate what happens inside the sun. Now, this is so much more than just another energy project. It's a $22 billion science experiment between a whole host of nations all coming together to try and change how we generate power on this planet.
ITER's mission to create a new carbon-free energy source couldn't be more urgent. Global energy use is projected to nearly double by 2050, and we've got to drastically cut our use of fossil fuels. Some scientists hope that controlled nuclear fusion could be the holy grail of energy, but there's a catch. As it stands right now, no reactor has ever been able to produce more energy through nuclear fusion than it takes in. ITER's aiming to be the first, and if it's a success, it could quite literally change the world.
Nuclear fusion, the energy which fires the hydrogen bomb, and the sun. Could this be the pot of gold waiting at the end of the rainbow? To provide energy which is cheap, clean, and inexhaustible.
In November 1985, General Secretary Gorbachev of the Soviet Union made a proposal to US President Ronald Reagan: form an international coalition to develop fusion energy for peaceful purposes. A year later, the EU, Japan, Soviet Union and US all agreed to design a nuclear fusion facility called ITER. Today, that effort's grown to include thousands of engineers and scientists across 35 member nations.
Scientists plan to use this 23,000-ton reactor to, basically in layman's terms, create a tiny star here on Earth that's then used to power the world. Now, if that sounds like a really big deal to you, it's because it is.
The nuclear reactors you're probably familiar with use a process called fission, where atoms are split apart and energy is released in the form of heat and radiation. That's the same process that powers those terrible atomic bombs and the nuclear power plants we have today. It's driven by elements like uranium and plutonium, which can be hard to get hold of and end up as dangerous nuclear waste. Nuclear fusion, however, is the process by which atoms are fused together using elements that are abundant on Earth, like the hydrogen isotopes you can extract from water. Heat generated from nuclear fusion reactors can be used to produce steam that can power turbines and generators to create electricity. Once you can do that, you kind of have an unlimited supply of carbon-free energy that isn't dictated by whether it's sunny or windy. The problem is, achieving efficient, scalable nuclear fusion here on Earth is still really hard to do. You need a machine that can withstand temperatures 10 times hotter than the core of the Sun and twice the force required to launch a space shuttle. That's all to say this thing has to be really, really durable, and that's where the insane levels of concrete and engineering that you see going on here all come into play. Here's how it'll work. Hydrogen atoms are injected into this vacuum vessel, then a giant superconducting magnet around the machine is turned on, and the voltage strips the electrons from their atoms, forming something called plasma. It's a state of matter that's sort of like gas. Hopefully you're still with us. That plasma is then heated to extreme temperatures of up to 150 million degrees Celsius. The atoms then fuse together and release a huge burst of thermal energy in the process. That nuclear reaction produces 4 times as much energy as nuclear fission, and 4 million times the amount of energy you can get from burning the same amount of coal, oil or gas. The ITER tokamak will be the largest and most powerful fusion device in the world, with 1 million components and 10 million parts. Those parts are all made and assembled by ITER's member countries and then shipped here to this 445-acre site in France. It's kind of like building a Lego kit, just 10 million times more complicated.
I'm Colette Ricketts and I work as the Deputy Head of the Project Control Office for ITER organisation. It's my job to make sure that all the bits that are needed to put together the Lego kit that is ITER show up on time, the right colour, the right shape, the right time. I'm the Grand Master of the Lego kit.
With so many heavy components needed to make the machine, 104 kilometres of roadway have been specially modified into something that's now known as the ITER itinerary.
We've built bridges, we've widened roads, we have police convoys to get our components through. It's a massive undertaking just to move a component.
Everything then comes here into the massive assembly hall. Parts are put together and these enormous cranes on the ceiling above my head lift it up and over into the reactor.
At its core, we're still building the same facility we were building and was imagined decades ago, But of course, every week something changes because we're on a global platform. Pandemics, Brexit, political elections. So then we reschedule, we reorientate our programme. I spend most of my time saying, well, that was the plan, but nothing goes to plan, and this is how we're going to adapt.
Now, I'm a self-confessed construction geek, and ITER really is the ultimate construction project. If you thought getting one national government to build an infrastructure scheme was hard, try doing it with 35 nations, all with different languages, cultures and building practices. It's a pretty nuclear level of project collaboration, and tools from Think Projects are helping to make it all happen.
So it's the coming together of these nations who recognise that there's a problem with the environmental conditions, recognise the potential of fusion to solve the baseload energy problem, and are now working together in the most amazing collaborative way. I think there's something like 45 native languages at the ITER head office. It's an amazing thing.
Behind all the concrete, magnets and metal, there's a lot of different people building, shipping and assembling millions of specialised parts. And all those different people contributing to ITER need contracts to get paid and make sure their work is being accounted for. Think Project manages contracts for nearly 400 users across 30 organisations and those 35 nations. It's not the most glamorous part of the project, but it's the glue that kind of keeps the whole thing together. The stakes are high for ITER, and staying organised is essential. There's been a lot of money invested in this, and it's a crucial moment in our energy transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable sources. The immense project is scheduled to first power on in 2025, when they'll hope to create plasma. Eventually, the goal is to create, at least for a few seconds, what scientists call net energy, where more energy is produced than used. Once that small task is done, the next challenge will be to actually funnel the energy made through fusion into our existing power grids. But that's still a couple of decades away and will likely be taken up by other reactors. ITER isn't the only group trying to harness the power of nuclear fusion. A growing number of coalitions and private companies are racing to figure out how to make fusion power commercially viable and competitive with the price of fossil fuels. The new US infrastructure bill has a number of provisions for nuclear energy research and production. Once someone cracks the code, commercially scalable carbon-free energy production would dramatically reduce the world's dependence on fossil fuels. But it'll take time, and lowering the costs of renewable energy might help us get there first.
The possibility of a future that is good for our children and our children's children with a good standard of living demands fusion. There's no other solution.
Standing here at the very centre of this reactor that could quite literally change the world is a really powerful reminder of just how impactful the construction industry can be. You know, none of this would be possible without the sector that so many of you work to create every day. Yeah, the spot where I'm currently standing in decades to come could be seen as the birthplace of a new kind of energy on this planet. I'm not sure it gets cooler than that.
This is one of the biggest energy megaprojects in North America, but you've probably never heard of it. That's because it's a type of infrastructure that doesn't get as much attention as power plants or dams, despite being equally hard to build and just as crucial to the world's power supply. With the global energy crisis showing no signs of stopping, gas prices stuck at record highs, and shortages made worse by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ensuring there's enough of the stuff to go around has become a bit of a challenge. But when this enormous new facility in Canada completes in a few years, it could provide a much needed new source of fuel that'll reach far and wide, as well as providing a huge economic boost.
The single largest private sector investment in the history of Canada.
But in an industry where competition between countries is fiercer than ever, and with renewables on the rise, is this Canada's chance to become the next energy superpower? Or has it missed the boat? Okay, so let's get right to it. What exactly is this mega project, and why does it require digging up such a huge chunk of this stunning landscape? Well, it's all taking place in the small town of Kitimat, and the consortium behind it goes by the name of LNG Canada. LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. And yes, we know what you're thinking, and yes, you're right. Fossil fuels are bad, and Canada is supposedly a world leader in renewable energy. So why is it building something like this? Well, Canada is one of the world's biggest producers of natural gas, but unlike the US, Qatar or Australia, it doesn't have any way of exporting it overseas.
The gas industry, of course, sees a huge amount of gas underground in a place called the Montney Basin, it's sort of northeastern British Columbia, and they're thinking we need to get this stuff to market. We need to be able to make some money from this. But the problem is that there's not a big population center nearby. They need to get it somewhere else.
Hence why Canada is now building its first LNG scheme, set to cost more than 40 billion Canadian dollars in total. A task that, as these pictures clearly show, is more than a little bit complicated. But hang on a moment, let's take a step back before we go any further. Isn't natural gas a gas, not a liquid? Yes, it'll still be a gas when it comes into this new terminal via the Coastal Gas Link, a new 670km pipeline that runs all the way from the source up in Dawson Creek. Yes, that is the name of the town where the gas comes from. But if you want to send gas to another country or continent, there's an ocean in the way, and it's too far to simply build another pipeline. You'll need special tankers like these. To make it safe for transport, and so you can fit as much of it as possible on board, the gas has to be converted into a liquid. Then it's placed in these huge tanks and shipped over before it's turned back into a gas at the other end. It sounds simple when you summarise it like that, but the actual process is far from straightforward, and the same goes for the construction. Now, you'll be pleased to know that we're not going to try and explain what every single component on this site does and how it's being built, because that would clearly take some time. So instead, we're going to pick out a few highlights. Firstly, what are those things that look like huge cages covered in pipes? They're the process modules. 35 metres tall and weighing over 4,500 tonnes, this one was the first to be installed. Its job is to act as the entry point for gas coming in from the pipeline and to send it on to be treated and processed. These giant structures were all manufactured in China and carried over on ships. To get them from the port to the site, they had to be placed on the back of large transporters and carefully moved by road before being lowered onto specially built foundations. It wasn't a one-off task either. In total, more than a dozen of these modules are going in. Next, there's the absorber column. It's used to remove carbon dioxide from the gas before it's liquefied. Weighing over 800 tonnes and measuring 54 metres long, it's the largest single piece of equipment at the site, requiring several hours and 3 cranes to install. But the one thing you really can't help but notice when looking down from above is this. The massive tank where the gas is stored before it's piped onto those ships. 52 metres high and 92 metres in diameter, the colossal container is one of the biggest of its kind in the world. With a domed roof that had to be lifted into place very slowly. The lift was done using fans, which gradually pressurised the tank and raised the roof over 3 hours. Once in position, welders fixed it into place, and the air pressure inside could return to normal. With construction now over 70% complete, the terminal is set to come online sometime in the middle of this decade. And as for where all this gas is likely to go, well, Asia is the main target. It's the next closest continent to Canada's west coast. Many countries here are dependent on gas that has to be imported, and others are still burning coal, the worst of all fossil fuels. Yes, natural gas is a fossil fuel too, but it's not as bad as coal, so technically it is a lower carbon form of energy. But is it really going to get countries like China to stop using coal?
China is still importing large amounts of LNG, but they're still building coal plants. They don't necessarily use it for electricity. It's often used for domestic consumption, or it's used for powering industry. So as far as getting off coal, well, that may be one of the possibilities that may happen, or it could just be that China, places like China, will import LNG and still burn their domestic coal because coal is cheaper.
So what about Europe, which has had to scramble over the past year to fill the gap in its gas supplies left behind by Russia and its war on Ukraine?
Europe's energy crisis, one that could tilt not just the continent, but the entire world into a possible recession.
According to Shell, one of the 5 companies behind LNG Canada, 2022 saw LNG imports to Europe increase by 60%. Surely then, one of the world's biggest gas producers suddenly becoming an exporter is good news for Europeans. Well, first off, they're in the opposite direction to Asia, which would mean very long journeys to reach them. Also, despite needing more of it in the short term, Europe is pushing hard to get off fossil fuels for good as soon as possible. And right there, you have one of the potential problems with this whole project: the timing. When it finally gets up and running, many nations are going to be looking at much cleaner alternatives to natural gas, and the chances are that overall demand will be lower by then. Canada will also be coming up against competitors that have already been doing LNG for years. Another issue is the cost, which has grown significantly, not on the LNG terminal, but with that pipeline. There's also the impacts on local communities, the First Nations. LNG Canada says it's working closely with them on the main site, but there have been disagreements further inland.
Coastal GasLink pipeline was originally estimated to cost about, around $6 billion. The latest cost estimate is $14 billion. These are Canadian dollars. And then at the same time, First Nations, the Aboriginal people of the Montney Basin, have been concerned about the impacts of drilling and forestry on their hunting and fishing rights.
The industry had to make an agreement with the government and the First Nations that limited the amount of drilling in the basin, and that could push up the cost of supply as well. All in all, LNG Canada represents something of a gamble for the companies involved, and to some extent the country. It's undeniably impressive from a construction point of view, and it's offering something that's clearly needed at the moment all over the world. But as is often the case with these megaprojects, whether it ends up being worth the cost, both financially and environmentally, remains to be seen. This dam is absolutely huge. The reservoir behind it will be roughly the same size as London, while the dam itself will be twice as tall as the Golden Gate Bridge. Welcome to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, an epic name for an epic feat of engineering. It's decades in the making and forms part of the country's so-called economic miracle, largely because it has the potential to lift millions of people out of poverty. But it could also be the dangerous spark that ignites a whole new conflict in the region.
Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia are at odds over who controls the world's longest river.
A fight for the Nile. This is the largest dam in Africa, so large it has its own classification. It's a mega dam.
Mega what?
Once complete, it'll produce over 5,000 megawatts of electricity, more than double Ethiopia's current output today, and its reservoir will hold 74 billion cubic meters of water. The numbers here don't get any less overwhelming. The dam itself is made of 10 million cubic meters of roller-compacted concrete and is set to include 2 power stations, 3 spillways, and a saddle dam. The main dam itself will be 145 meters deep by 1.7 kilometers long, while the saddle dam supporting the main structure will be an astonishing 4.8 kilometers long by 45 meters high. There'll be 2 outdoor power stations on either bank of the river, with the capacity to generate roughly 2,000 to 3,700 megawatts of power. The first step on the journey to build something as enormous as this kind of sets the tone for the rest of the project: the casual diversion of the Blue Nile River in 2013. Now, as dramatic as that sounds, it's actually pretty common when building dams. Here's how it works. Most dams are built over rivers, but to pour concrete you need a dry working area. So diversion channels or tunnels are formed around the side of a dam's location for the period of its construction. If you're going through hard rock, then explosives are normally used to clear a path, while soft soils and rocks are excavated. Once there's a dry space for workers, foundations are laid. They have to be strong enough to withstand the weight of the dam and the enormous water pressures acting on them. As we said, the Renaissance Dam will be 145 metres deep, almost the height of a skyscraper, and that 74 billion cubic metres of water behind it will create a lot of pressure. Those foundations absolutely cannot leak, so the soil and rocks in the ground below the dam have to be strength tested and are sometimes removed and replaced with stronger materials. Once a dam is complete and in place, the diversion channels around it are blocked and water typically builds into a reservoir behind the dam structure. That's exactly what happened at the Hoover Dam on the Arizona-Nevada border. Water is let through openings in the dam as necessary and often harnessed for hydroelectric power. The immense scale of the Renaissance Dam has likely required special on-site concrete batching plants to be established close to the worksite. They help to increase efficiency and can ensure more control over the delivery of materials, something that's essential once you've started a big concrete pour. But a lot of the construction details for the Renaissance Dam have been kept under wraps, and that's all due to the somewhat fragile political nature of this project. You see, the dam is being built here on the Blue Nile, just 30 kilometres upstream from the Sudan border, and it's caused fierce debate over exactly who owns the Nile and the water flowing in it.
Egypt's President Sisi says the Nile is a question of life, a matter of existence to Egypt.
It's worried that its share of the water will be reduced when Ethiopia starts to fill the massive dam.
There is no Egypt without water. We either have water or there is no future for us.
Further downriver is Egypt, and Egypt's pretty much entirely built around the Nile. An astounding 85% of the country's water comes from just this one source, and some 95% of the country's population live within a few kilometres of this famous river. Canals from the Nile irrigate farms and support cities, agriculture and fishing. The Nile has breathed life into this desert region for thousands of years, and if something were to happen to jeopardise that water source, well, the consequences could be disastrous, and Egypt knows this. Now, to design any kind of dam, let alone a mega dam with a reservoir the size of London, you need a pretty solid grasp on engineering and maths. While the way you learn to solve equations at school may have been a bit daunting, today's video sponsor Brilliant.org teaches subjects like maths, science and engineering in a hands-on and visual way. Each course is broken down into short, bite-sized classes, which makes it easy to make regular progress. And there are daily rewards to help keep you on a learning streak. A solid understanding of geometry is key to anybody working or aspiring to work in construction. With Brilliant, you can quickly learn the fundamentals like finding the area, or advanced topics like Polomino tiling. Whether you want to learn a new skill from scratch, brush up on the stuff you might have forgotten from school, or just learn for fun, Brilliant.org is a great way to test your brain power and learn key skills at the same time. To get started, try a free 30-day offer by visiting brilliant.org/the B1M or by clicking the link in the description. The first 200 people to sign up will receive a 20% discount off Brilliant's annual subscription. Now, let's get back to the Nile. Tensions in the region are high, and this dam seems to be at the centre of it. Egypt was even reportedly prepared to bomb it to protect their stake in the Nile. So why would Ethiopia risk a potential war, all for a shiny new dam? Well, its government is hoping this megaproject will actually help lift the entire country out of poverty. Half of all Ethiopians today don't have access to electricity. The dam is going to change that. The country is already on the fast track to achieving its economic goals. Ethiopia's become Africa's fastest growing economy, in part boosted by massive investment in infrastructure. During this period of transformational growth, Ethiopia has managed to reduce the number of people living in extreme poverty dramatically, from over 50% of the population to 31%. It's been called the Ethiopian economic miracle, and is becoming a model for other African countries. Major infrastructure projects play such an important role in this process. For its part, Ethiopia has argued that the effects of the dam are going to be minimal on the countries that are downstream, while the benefits will be plentiful and can be shared. But the debate over who can lay claim to the waters continues. Today, talks between the countries have almost completely broken down, with no agreement met, despite the dam now being 90% complete and scheduled to be filled within 3 years. Whatever the outcome, this is a piece of infrastructure that's likely to reshape more than just rivers in the region. It's a site that hasn't been seen in the US for over 30 years. A new nuclear reactor nearing completion, 2 of them in fact. Yes, the country that has more of these than anywhere else has now finally started building them again, and it couldn't come at a better time. With fossil fuels falling out of favour, nuclear faces a possible comeback. But this monster of a construction project has been a long time in the making. Costs have spiralled sharply and mistakes have been made.
Vogtle is well behind its originally intended schedule, double the original budget.
People didn't know how to pour concrete correctly. The design wasn't finished enough. Techniques had to be invented and then changed on the job.
And yet it could still mark the beginning of an American nuclear revival that not too long ago seemed impossible. When you think clean energy, you'll probably imagine wind turbines, solar panels, or maybe a hydroelectric dam. But what about this? That's right, nuclear power. It's not everyone's idea of clean. The errors of the past and concerns about waste have made many of us sceptical about these places and the people operating them.
Now, if you'll excuse me, my fondue is just about...
There goes Albany!
But this is no joke. When the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, we need a reliable source of emission-free energy to fall back on, one that isn't years away from reality.
Coal is now extremely expensive. Natural gas is now extremely expensive. Wind and solar do not replace the functions of coal and natural gas, which is on-demand power.
Mark's a nuclear engineer and managing director of Radiant Energy Fund, which advises governments and companies on nuclear energy.
Even gas being on demand has been brought into question with the Texas blackouts of 2021, when we just didn't have the ability to deliver enough natural gas in very cold conditions to keep the whole grid going.
Now, we've been building nuclear reactors since the 50s, and it all started in the US. It was here that electricity was generated with a nuclear reactor for the first time, in a period when atomic power was still mostly known for weapons.
The peaceful atom is here now to serve what President Eisenhower has termed the needs rather than the fears of mankind.
Today, the US has by far the largest nuclear capacity of any country in the world, and yet it hasn't built any new nuclear plants for over 30 years. There are almost 100 reactors in operation across the country, but they were all made decades ago. A second reactor at Watts Bar in Tennessee was completed in 2015, but construction started on that back in the 1970s, so it's not seen as completely new. Now, there are reasons for America's nuclear decline, and they apply pretty much everywhere. In short, new reactors have become extremely expensive, and they take a long time to complete, which isn't helpful when experts say we could do with more of them. These days, there are also a lot more regulatory hurdles and safety procedures to follow. That's largely down to what happened at 3 Mile Island in 1979, where one reactor in Pennsylvania had a partial meltdown and became one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. After that, nuclear's popularity began to decline, and plans to build dozens of new reactors across the country were cancelled en masse.
In a developing country, you're desperate. You take whatever power plants that you can get, whatever power plants the rich world will finance for you. But in the rich world, we got a little bit complacent, and it meant that if enough people didn't like nuclear, why go through all that effort as a national leader or as a political party? Why put up with the opposition to nuclear when you could just not build anything or build something more popular like wind or solar?
It's not just the US that's finding it difficult to revive this industry. Hinkley Point C, the only nuclear power plant being built in the UK, is at least 18 months behind schedule. Even in France, which has a greater share of nuclear power than any other country, a new reactor at Flamanville is expected to cost €300 million more than first forecast. It's fair to say the US nuclear sector has never fully recovered. The last power plant to begin construction here was back in 1978. Having any new reactors, let alone whole new plants, was starting to feel like a thing of the past. But that's all about to change.
America is back in the nuclear energy industry, folks. We are back.
America's finally getting its first new reactors in decades, built on the site of the existing plant Vogtle in Georgia, which has been home to two since 1989. Located east of Waynesboro, close to the border with South Carolina, Units 3 and 4 at Vogtle are the only nuclear reactors currently under construction in the whole United States. Once finished, they'll provide enough clean energy through nuclear fission to power 500,000 homes and businesses for 60 to 80 years. When combined with Units 1 and 2, Vogtle will generate more electricity than any other nuclear facility in the US. The project's being managed by Southern Nuclear and Georgia Power, with Bechtel handling the construction. As you can imagine, building a nuclear reactor involves bringing together a whole lot of components, some of them small and others very large indeed. By far the biggest piece on each unit is the CA-20 module. 5 stories high and weighing almost 1,000 tons, they store used fuel, exchange heat and collect waste. Wall and floor sections were prefabricated on site, and putting the modules in place required the heaviest lifts on the whole project, using one of the largest cranes in the world. Installing the 2 steam generators needed for each reactor was another complex task. Assembled in South Korea, they had to be transported from the coast to the site by train. They're 25 meters long and also had to be craned into place. So, how much has all this heavy lifting cost, and has it remained on schedule? Well, a lot, and no. Back in 2009, when the project was first approved, it was set to total around $14 billion, with a target completion date of 2016 for Unit 3 and 2017 for Unit 4. Now we're in 2022 and the work is only just wrapping up, and as for that price tag, well, it's looking closer to $30 billion. That makes it a contender for the most expensive nuclear power project ever, and it's not even an entire plant, just an extension, albeit a big one. To be fair, a large public infrastructure project going over budget is not exactly unusual. It's kinda normal for the final cost to be somewhat higher than the original estimates, especially when the project's been running for years or even decades. But now it's costing more than double what it was supposed to, you can see why some people are a bit annoyed. As for the delays, well, a lot of it comes down to the way it's been managed. The company that makes the reactors, and that was previously the main contractor, has had a part to play. Vogtle 3 and 4 are the first AP1000 units from the Westinghouse Electric Company to be built in the US. However, in 2017, the company filed for bankruptcy due to heavy losses from Vogtle and the VC summer plant in South Carolina, where it was supplying a further 2 reactors. Although work on Vogtle 3 and 4 was able to continue during this period, a new contractor, Bechtel, had to be appointed for the rest of the build.
We forgot how to build. Now, the theory was that because several AP1000s, the reactor design that was being used, were in construction in other countries, we could learn from those countries and learn how to construct it ourselves. But with the supply chains different, management teams different, engineering teams different, we just didn't learn from the AP1000s under construction in China.
Construction productivity was another challenge that's led to delays at Vogtle, along with the significant amount of remediation that's had to be done. By that we mean having to redo certain jobs, and on a nuclear reactor that can be somewhat time-consuming. According to one report, almost 100 miles of cable, around 8% of the total used, had to be cut or replaced. Another report revealed how on one part of the project, an inspection to check bolts were tightened to a specific degree didn't happen. That meant they all had to be loosened and retightened correctly before the inspection record could be signed off. Then, in December 2021, it emerged that tens of thousands of these records had not been completed, creating a massive backlog. The tasks had been carried out, but the paperwork hadn't been done. But today, with these problems now sorted, the mood is a lot more positive, and the end is finally in sight. Construction of Unit 3 is now officially complete, and in August 2022, Unit 4 was at 96%. That same month, Southern Company received some much-needed good news. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission confirmed that Unit 3 conformed with its regulations. That gave the plant clearance to start loading fuel and begin the startup sequence for the reactor, with commercial operation now expected in the first quarter of 2023. The plan is to have Unit 4 up and running by December that year. It may have taken much longer and cost far more than expected, but the conclusion of this project will be a big moment, not just for the people of Georgia, but the entire US. While there's no sign yet of a mad rush to build more of these things, more will surely follow, and several are already planned or proposed, but they're yet to begin construction. Once Vogtle crosses the finish line and lessons have been learned, it could help kick these other schemes into gear.
If Vogtle is being finished in a time when the alternatives to Vogtle are extremely expensive or only a partial substitute for what nuclear power would be, the conditions are right to move on and start other large-scale nuclear plants, or to start on some new designs that people have been proposing for building around the US.
We now have proof the US remains serious about this important and still quite divisive form of energy thanks to the hard work that's been carried out with this project. It proves that nuclear power has a future in America, but to what extent, we'll just have to wait and see. What happens when a giant nuclear reactor comes to the end of its life? More than half of these hugely complex systems are now over 30 years old, and many have already been running for longer than they were supposed to. The answer sounds simple at first, you take it apart. But how do you dismantle something this big and hazardous, and why are some projects taking decades to complete? Well, let's take a look inside one power plant that sets a new standard for nuclear decommissioning to see how it's done. If you thought nuclear power was mostly a thing of the past, think again. Right now, there are more than 400 active nuclear reactors worldwide, and that number could grow significantly. It's a type of energy that's now considered much cleaner than fossil fuels when combined with renewables, even when you factor in the waste. That's why there's been a drive to build more power plants and maintain the ones we've got. But therein lies the problem. By 2050, almost 50% of the reactors currently in use worldwide are set to begin decommissioning. Now, in brief terms, decommissioning is the process of dismantling a nuclear reactor or facility when it's no longer needed. It involves removing the fuel, breaking down the various structures and components, extracting all the hazardous materials, and doing lots of decontamination. Afterwards, the site can either be used to put new reactors in, or for something else entirely. Why would a reactor be decommissioned? Well, it could be down to new regulations, running costs, or maybe it's in a country that's decided to phase out nuclear completely, like Germany or Italy. But this power plant elsewhere in Europe is being decommissioned for a different reason. When Slovakia joined the European Union in 2004, it did so under one key condition. Formerly part of the USSR, it would have to take apart all of the Soviet-era reactors it still had in operation, which no longer met the EU's safety standards. A pair of reactors at the V1 nuclear power plant in Bohunice, which had been running since 1978, were unfortunately on the list. They were among the first WWER reactors, a type of pressurized water design to come out of the Soviet Union. Over almost 3 decades of operation, they supplied enough electricity to power the entire country for 5 years. But after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, the safety of early Soviet reactors became a big concern for the EU. The 2 units were switched off in 2006 and 2008. Decommissioning began in 2011, and by 2022, both reactors had been fully dismantled. As well as being paid for by Slovakia, 7 other countries have contributed to a support fund managed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. In total, the project is expected to cost around $1.3 billion and is being carried out by Slovakia's state-owned nuclear company. Now, decommissioning is necessary, but still, $1.3 billion isn't cheap. Thankfully for some, it's being funded by those governments, as money from the private sector is hard to come by in 2024. Europe is still dealing with the aftershocks of the energy crisis, and the ultra-wealthy are more concerned with locking down what they have rather than splashing out for potential rewards. The richest billionaires and CEOs are building a wealth foundation that includes physical assets like gold, residential real estate, and billions of dollars worth of fine art. The QR code right here will unlock the high-powered world of art investing for you too, because that code takes you to our video sponsors at Masterworks. The art investing platform has distributed back more than $55 million in investor proceeds across their 22 exits, some of which went to investors who didn't know a thing about art. Over 900,000 members have signed up, and that number is growing by the day. With previous investable offerings from legends like Basquiat, Picasso, and Banksy, shares of some paintings have sold out in minutes. But since so many of the B1M subscribers have signed up so far, you can still skip the waitlist and start investing today by going to the QR code on screen or masterworks.art/the B1M. Now, let's get back to those nuclear reactors and find out exactly how they dismantled them. The good news is that we're not going to go over every single nut and bolt because that would take some time. Instead, here's a summary of the key phases. First up was the removal of all the systems and buildings that were no longer needed to support the dismantling of the remaining equipment. These included the turbines, the transformers, and the switchboards. At the same time, radioactive waste from the operation of the reactor was processed. More on that in a bit. Then, after a few years of this, work began on demolishing some of the structures that are more visible from the outside, like the cooling towers. They were 120 metres tall, and there were 4 of them, leaving behind 50,000 cubic metres of concrete, most of which was recycled or used to backfill the holes. Next, it was on to stage 2, which is where we find the really interesting stuff, starting with arguably the most critical component of all, the reactor pressure vessel. Inside this is where you'll find the coolant, followed by the core itself. Yes, that's by far the most radioactive section of the entire plant, where the atomic fission takes place, creating the heat that powers the whole system. A giant crane was installed to remove the vessel from the reactor shaft before it was placed into a special pool. This is so it could be taken apart remotely beneath the surface. Why? Well, because this part of the job involved segmenting highly radioactive waste, and doing that underwater meant workers were shielded from the radiation. But before these pools could be constructed, they had to make space for them, and that meant removing the steam generators, which required more heavy lifting. Believe it or not, these are where steam is produced that's used to turn the turbines, which then generate electricity. At Bohunice, the generators were almost 12 metres long, weighing 145 tonnes. And there were 6 of them on each reactor. Each one had to be transported across the facility to the former turbine hall where they were fragmented, in other words, chopped up into pieces. Massive circular saws were needed to slice through the 140mm thick steel casings and the more than 5,000 heat exchange tubes inside each one. But even with the reactors taken out, the shafts left behind also had to be broken down. That's because the concrete had become radioactive as well. The solution was to cut it into blocks, smash those blocks up with a hydraulic hammer, and send the rubble away for storage. Of the more than 800,000 tonnes of material that had to be sorted through, radioactive waste amounted to less than 1%, albeit that's still quite a lot when you do the maths. So how did they get rid of it? Well, the answer was by sending it to the waste treatment centre that happens to be on the same site. Here, the waste is either separated, incinerated, compressed, or a combination of all 3 before it's packaged up and placed in containers. These are then sent off to a repository like the one at Mahortse to the east, where the waste is sealed in reinforced concrete boxes surrounded by multiple barriers. As well as storage facilities like this, there are also fuel processing plants across Europe which also have to be decommissioned when the time is right. France has one of the biggest at Le Hague, which is currently going through the process. What are the differences between this and a reactor site? Well, because there's a lot more radioactivity to deal with here, a lot of the cleanup is done remotely via operated vehicles and robotic equipment. Where humans are allowed inside, contamination is everywhere, including on the walls. To remove it, special resins are applied to the surfaces, which are then peeled off, bringing all the nasty stuff with them. Back at Bohunice, the plan is to have the entire site cleared so it can be reused for non-nuclear industrial activities by 2027. In the meantime, because it became the first plant worldwide to decommission a reactor of this type, its team of experts are now sharing their experiences. With countries from Armenia to Uzbekistan now planning similar projects, learning lessons from Slovakia could help give them a big head start. Overall, decommissioning is an immense job, one that's been made a lot harder by the fact that most reactors weren't built with this step in mind. But things are starting to change. Some countries like Canada have now taken steps to ensure that any new facilities are designed with end of life as a priority instead of as an afterthought. Then there's the rise of small modular reactors, an advanced and compact new alternative to traditional reactors, which many consider to be the future of energy. They can be installed and crucially disassembled far more easily than the ones we've just seen, although they're yet to be fully adopted. So while decommissioning is a huge hassle at the moment, that might not be the case for much longer, which is just as well, because if nuclear is to become the major source of clean energy that many expect it to be, we're gonna need to plan ahead. And as always guys, if you enjoyed this video and want to get more from the definitive video channel for construction, make sure you're subscribed to the B1M.